Her name was Kisa Gotami, and she had stopped crying 3 days ago, not because the grief had passed, because she had moved past grief into something harder, certainty. The certainty that if she knocked on enough doors, asked enough people, found the right person with the right medicine, she could fix what had already happened. Her son was 2 years old. He had died that morning. She was carrying him through the streets of Savatthi anyway. Door after door, she asked for medicine. Door after door. P. Opal looked at the child in her arms and looked away. Some were kind, some were not. All of them told her the same thing. There is no medicine for this. There is nothing to be done. Someone, a neighbor, a merchant, a stranger whose name history did not keep, pointed her toward a grove outside the city walls. There is a man there, they said. He has helped people no one else could help. She walked until she found him. The man looked at her without flinching. He listened, and then he made her a promise. He would help her, but first she had to bring him one thing, a mustard seed, ordinary, the kind found in any kitchen in any home in Savatthi, but it had to come from a house that had never known death, not one death, not one loss, a house that grief had never touched. She believed him. She turned around and walked back into the city. We will come back to what she found, but not yet. Because the real question is not about Kisa Gotami. The real question is about you. You have felt this. Maybe not grief this sharp. Maybe not a loss this total. But you have lain awake at 2 a.m, and the hard thing that happened, the argument, the diagnosis, the failure, the humiliation, was hours behind you. And yet your mind was still there, still pressing on the wound, still asking why, still building the case for how bad it is, how long it will last, what it means about who you are. The hard thing happened once. Your mind has made it happen 40 times since. This is not weakness. This is not a character flaw. This is a mechanism, precise, predictable, and 2,500 years old. The Buddha had a name for it. He described it in such plain language that his monks must have felt the words land somewhere in their own chests. This is not a video about becoming emotionless. This is not a video about forcing yourself to think positive. This is not a video about chanting your pain away until it gets embarrassed and leaves. This is a video about an arrow, and the moment you realize you are holding the bow, it was an ordinary afternoon in a grove near Savatthi. No thunder, no miracle, no crowd of thousands. The Buddha sat with a small group of monks, men who had left their homes, their families, their former lives, and he asked them a question so simple it must have felt like a trick. When an untrained person is touched by a painful feeling, he said, what do? The monks waited. They sorrow, they grieve, they beat their chest, they weep, they fall into confusion. He paused. They feel 2 feelings, a bodily one and a mental one. Then he asked the second part. When a trained person is touched by the same painful feeling, what do? They feel one feeling, he said. The bodily one, not the mental one. That is the whole teaching. That is the Salatha Sutta, the Arrow Sutta, recorded in the Samyutta Nikaya over 2,500 years ago. 2 arrows, one that life fires at you, one that you fire at yourself. The Buddha was not describing 2 kinds of people. He was describing 2 moments inside the same person. The moment the pain arrives, and the moment you decide what to do with it. Here's what most people miss about this teaching. The Buddha did not say the trained person feels no pain. He did not say meditation erases the first arrow. He said the trained person feels it fully and stops there. One feeling, the bodily one. They do not add a second. The Pali word in that sutra is salasa, the arrow, not a metaphor borrowed from poetry. A precise image chosen by a man who grew up in a warrior culture, who understood exactly what an arrow does, enters the body at a specific point. It causes a specific wound, and then, if you are not careful, you reach for a second one and drive it in yourself. The first arrow is the phone call with bad news. The second arrow is the 3 hours you spend afterward deciding it means your life is ruined. The first arrow is the argument. The second arrow is the week you spend replaying every word, rewriting your responses, prosecuting yourself for what you said and what you didn't. The first arrow is the diagnosis. The second arrow is lying awake, constructing the worst possible future in such precise detail that your body cannot tell the difference between the imagined catastrophe and the real one. Pain, then suffering, The first is life. The second is you. Stay with me, because here is where it gets uncomfortable. The monks sitting with the Buddha that afternoon were not monks yet when their lives first broke. They were farmers and merchants and sons of wealthy families who had experienced the first arrow: grief, illness, failure, the slow suffocation of a life that did not fit, and then spent years firing the second one into themselves before they found their way to that grove. Ananda knew this better than anyone. Ananda was the Buddha's closest attendant for 25 years. He remembered every word the Buddha spoke. He was present at nearly every teaching recorded in the Pali Canon. He was also a man who could not stop shooting himself with second arrows. When the Buddha called his monks together and told them, calmly, plainly, the way he said everything, that in 3 months he would pass from this world, Ananda stood it for as long as he could. Then he went behind a doorway and wept. Not for a few minutes. He wept until someone found him and brought him back. The Buddha did not scold him. He called him by name, Ananda, and said something that has stayed in the canon for 2.5 millennia. Enough, Ananda. Do not grieve. Do not lament. Have I not already told you that all things that are dear to us must one day change, must one day end, must one day be separated from us? He was not telling Ananda to feel less. He was pointing at the second arrow. The grief over the grief. The suffering added on top of the sorrow that was already real enough on its own. Ananda understood. Eventually, it took him years after the Buddha's death. The texts tell us he was still not fully enlightened when the first great council of monks gathered. He wept through the night before it, and then, sometime in those dark hours, he set the bow down. He walked into the council the next morning as a different man. This is not a story about suppressing emotion. It is a story about the difference between the wave and the drowning. Now watch what happens when the teaching reaches a king. Pasenadi was the ruler of Kosala, one of the most powerful kingdoms of his age. He had armies, palaces, more food than he could eat in 10 lifetimes. That last part was the problem. Pasenadi could not stop eating. He would arrive at the Buddha's grove so full he could barely sit upright, and he was ashamed of himself. And his shame made him eat more, and the eating made him more ashamed. The first arrow was appetite. The second was self-contempt. The third was the way he used food to dull the second arrow, which only sharpened it. The Buddha did not lecture him on discipline or willpower. He gave him one verse from the Dhammapada, a single thought about awareness and measure, and told him to find a boy, a young attendant, and have the boy recite the verse aloud before every meal, a mindfulness anchor. An external reminder placed exactly at the moment between the first arrow and the second. Pasenadi did it. The texts record that he gradually lost the weight, not because he fought his appetite harder, because he interrupted the automatic reach for the second bow. The Pali word for what Pasenadi learned is dukkha, and it is not what you think it means. It is not simply sadness. The literal root of the word describes a wheel that is off its axle, not broken, off its center, grinding where it should roll, creating friction where there should be motion. That grinding, that off-center friction, is what the second arrow produces, not a new wound, a wheel that cannot run straight. So far, 3 stories. 3 different people, a grieving attendant, a king drowning in shame, and a woman we have not yet returned to, and the same pattern running underneath all of them. The first arrow lands. That part is not negotiable. Grief arrives, appetite arrives, loss arrives. The body registers it, and there is nothing, no meditation, no philosophy, no amount of discipline that stops the first arrow. But the second arrow is different. The second arrow has a moment, a gap, a fraction of a second between the pain and the story you tell about the pain. And in that gap, there is something that looks very much like a choice. If this is landing for you, if you have felt this gap and not known what to call it, consider subscribing. There is more of this ahead, and the part that comes next is the part most people never hear. The Buddha's chief disciple, Sariputta, was known for one thing, above everything else. Not compassion, not charisma, not miracles. Precision. When the Buddha wanted something explained with surgical accuracy, he sent Sariputta. And it was Sariputta who gave the second arrow teaching its backbone. The Pali term is yoniso manasikara. Wise attention. Appropriate attention. The kind of attention that sees a thing for what it actually is. Not what you fear. It means, not what it reminds you of. Not what it says about your worth as a human being, just what it is. Unwise attention, yoniso manasikara, is the bow. It is the mental move that takes a painful feeling and immediately begins to construct a case around it. Why did this happen? What does it mean? Is this my fault? Will it always be this way? Am I fundamentally broken in some way that makes this make sense? You know this voice. You have heard it at 2 a.m. You have heard it in the shower, 3 days after something went wrong, when you thought you were past it and then you were not past it. That voice is not insight. It is not wisdom. It is not even grief. It is papañca. Papañca, the Pali word for mental proliferation. The mind's compulsive tendency to take one moment of pain and spin it into an entire cosmology of suffering. One argument becomes evidence of a pattern. One failure becomes proof of a verdict. One loss becomes the architecture of a life that will never be whole. The Buddha named papañca as one of the central obstacles to clarity. Not because thinking is bad, because compulsive, unexamined thinking, the kind that fires second arrows in automatic succession, barely pausing between shots, is how one painful moment becomes a year of suffering. And this is where the Western world gets it completely wrong. Because when modern Western audiences encounter the second arrow teaching, they often hear something like this: if you are suffering, it is your fault. You are choosing it. You have the power to stop. And if you have not stopped, that is a personal failure. That is not what the Buddha said. That is, in fact, the third arrow. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha lists the causes of bodily and mental pain with almost clinical detachment: bile, phlegm, wind, imbalance of seasons, irregular behavior, external assault, and yes, karma. But he is explicit. Not all suffering comes from past actions. Not all first arrows are deserved. Some are random. Some are the result of a body that gets sick, a world that is dangerous, a life that intersects with loss through no logic you can map or fault you can assign. The first arrow does not require your cooperation. It does not ask your permission. It does not care whether you have meditated for 10 years or 10 minutes. Pain is not a punishment. It is weather. What you do after that is where the teaching lives. Now, a woman named Patacara. She came from a good family in Savatthi. She had a husband she had chosen against her parents' wishes, 2 small children, a life that was hers. And then, in a single journey home, everything collapsed. Her husband was killed by a snake bite. Her younger child was taken by a hawk. Her older child drowned in a river swollen with rain. She arrived at her parents' home to discover it had collapsed in a storm and her parents and brother were inside. All of it. Gone. In the time it takes to walk from one city to the next. When she arrived at the gates of Jetavana Monastery, she was naked, her clothes torn off in her wandering. And she was speaking in fragments, circling, unreachable. The crowd gathered to watch her try to turn her away. People stepped back. The Buddha looked up. He said her name. Just her name, Patacara, the way you say a name when you need someone to come back from wherever they have gone. And something in that one word cut through. She stopped. She looked at him. She came back to herself enough to realize she was naked, and she sat down and covered herself and she wept, real weeping, not the fragmented madness of before. Present grief. First arrow grief. The Buddha did not tell her she would be fine. He did not tell her the losses were not real, that her children were at peace, that the universe had a plan. He sat with her in the grief and when she was ready, when the first arrow had been felt fully. Without the second arrows of self-blame and refusal stacked on top of it, he spoke. He showed her what she had been doing since the road. Not the grief. The grief was real and the grief was right. But the spiral, the self-accusation, the madness, the refusal to let the losses be losses, that was the second arrow. And the third. And the fourth, fired so fast, they had blurred into something that looked like reality itself. She did not leave the monastery. She became a nun and then a teacher. The Therigatha, one of the oldest collections of poetry in human history, written by and for the women of the early Sangha, preserves her words. Calm, clear, teaching other women who arrived the way she arrived, carrying losses too heavy to name, that the wound and the weapon are not the same thing. Here's the part nobody tells you. Patacara did not recover because the pain went away. She recovered because she learned to feel the first arrow without immediately reaching for the second. The pain stayed. The papañca, the spinning, the self-accusation, the endless construction of why, that was what she set down. And in the space where the second arrow had been, there was something she had not felt in a very long time. She could breathe. It is time to go back to Kisa Gotami. She has been walking for hours. She has knocked on every door she could find in Sabata, a city of tens of thousands, a city dense with homes and markets and temples and grief. She has asked the same question at every threshold. Do you have a mustard seed? Has death ever visited this house? Every door gave the same answer. A grandmother, 3 years gone. A child who did not survive the fever season. A husband lost to a war nobody remembers anymore. A mother. A brother. A neighbor who was here last spring and was not here this spring. Every house. Every single one. She walked the length and breadth of a city and found not one threshold that death had not crossed. She came back to the grove without a mustard seed. And here's what the Buddha actually said to her. Not a miracle, not a restoration, not the medicine she had been certain he possessed. He said, you thought you alone had lost a child, but death visits every house. It has always visited every house. The first arrow you are carrying is real. It landed. Your son is gone, and that is a grief that has no bottom and no apology. But Kisa Gotami, look at your hands. Look at how long you have been walking. Look at what you have been doing since morning. She looked. She had spent the entire day refusing to let the first arrow be the first arrow. She had been moving door to door, question to question, certain that if she just found the right answer, the wound would unhappen. She had been firing second arrows with every step, the refusal to accept. The certainty that somewhere in this city there was a house grief had forgotten, and if she found it, the rules would change. The loss would reverse. The child would breathe again. There was no such house. There had never been such a house, and the mustard seed the Buddha sent her to find was never a mustard seed. It was the realization she could only reach by walking every street herself. That the first arrow was real and finished and hers to carry. That the second arrows, the frantic search, the refusal, the door-to-door insistence that reality be different, those she could set down. She buried her son. The Therigatha records her voice decades later, older, steadier, teaching at the edge of the same city where she had once walked with a child she could not release. Her words are not distant or philosophical. They are the words of someone who has felt the first arrow and learned, through grief and time and the slow work of wise attention, to stop firing the second. Now, watch what happens when you bring this into your own life. Think about the last time you were overwhelmed. Not mildly stressed, genuinely overwhelmed, the kind where your chest is tight and your mind will not quiet and you cannot identify exactly when the feeling started or how to make it stop. The hard thing that happened, that was the first arrow. Real, valid, allowed to hurt. But the loop your mind ran afterward, the replay, the self-prosecution, the future building where everything goes wrong, the 2 a.m. arithmetic where you add up every mistake you have ever made and arrive at a conclusion about your worth. That was the second arrow, and the third, and the fourth fired so quickly in succession that they stopped feeling like choices and started feeling like facts. They are not facts. They are papañca. Mental proliferation. The bough you picked up without noticing you had picked it up. Yoniso manasikara, wise attention, does not ask you to feel less. It asks you to see clearly, to feel the first arrow fully, without flinching, without the story. And then to notice, with the quiet, precise attention of someone who has been taught to look, whether your hand is already reaching for the second. The gap between the first arrow and the second is small. Some days it is the width of a breath, but it is there. The Buddha built an entire path around the fact that it is there, and 2,500 years of people finding their way back from grief and madness and the unbearable weight of a mind that will not stop. Ananda weeping behind a doorway, Pasenadi ashamed at his own table, Patacara arriving at a monastery in pieces, Kisa Gotami walking a city that had no answer. All of them found the same thing in that gap, not the end of pain, just the moment before the second arrow, and the knowledge, hard-won and permanent, that you do not have to fire it. 2,500 years ago, in a grove outside a city that no longer exists, A man sat with a small group of people and said something so precise it has survived every empire and translation and century between that afternoon and this one. 2 arrows, one from life, one from you. Here is what that means for you right now. First, pain is not the same as suffering. The first arrow is pain. It is physical, emotional, real, and it does not ask your permission. Grief is a first arrow. Illness is a first arrow. Failure and loss, and the specific humiliation of a life that did not go the way you planned. Those are first arrows. You are allowed to feel them completely. The Buddha never asked anyone to feel less. He asked them to feel clearly. Second, the next time you notice you are overwhelmed, ask yourself one question. Is this the first arrow or the second? You do not need to answer it immediately. You do not need to fix anything in that moment. The question itself is yoniso manasikara. Wise attention. The act of asking is the act of noticing the bow in your hand. And noticing is where everything starts. Third, and this is the one that matters most, you have been carrying arrows you shot yourself. Not because you are weak, not because you are broken, not because you somehow deserve a heavier load than everyone else walking this earth, but because nobody showed you the difference between the wound and the weapon. Between what life did to you and what you did to yourself in response. Between the arrow that landed and the one still in your hand. Now you know the difference. Which arrow are you still carrying? Tell me below. Was it the first arrow that broke you or the second one you fired yourself? I read every comment. The grove where the Buddha first spoke these words is gone. The monastery at Jetavana is ruins. The tree is dust. But the arrow is still in flight across 2,500 years. And so is the choice. That choice has always been yours.